feel real comfortable going down to the nightclub to buy their diabetes medication, and they're not going to be real comfortable walking into a rec store to buy their medical marijuana. So those are the people that we also have to take care of and make sure that their needs are being met as we move forward. As much as the industry has grown and developed, they are still not in a place where they can support the needs of our most desperate patients. The patients that are using cannabis for epilepsy, they're using cannabis for to beat back cancer. They are taking high doses of concentrated oils, 1 to 2 grams of Phoenix tears a day. And they can't afford to get that from the industry. And if the industry even is providing that. So a lot of them grow it their own, use a caregiver, process it themselves so that it's more affordable. And until we can bring those things into balance so that patients' needs are being met by the industry, we really need to be careful how we manage through that transition.
Thank you. Karen, take us out of Colorado right now. But the same question, how does recreational or retail, non-medical, adult use legalization impact medical marijuana? What have you seen in Alaska and Washington where they didn't really have a regulated medical marijuana framework like we did in Colorado?
Yeah, Washington it was one of the very few states that didn't have a regulated dispensary system because of the heat of dispensary regulation. And so that's been the most controversial transition from medical to adult use. There were hundreds of dispensaries that existed, but were in a legal gray area or worse when they weren't really legal. And so now that you have tested regulated products from adult use stores, there was a lot of pressure to transition the medical system into something that was regulated and controlled instead. But at the same time, patients had been served by these dispensaries and were used to them. So right now, all of these gray market dispensaries are going to have to transition in. So there's a new application period for licensed marijuana businesses in Washington. I believe there's something like 1,000 applications filed where the adult use stores can get a medical license as well. And there's been a lot of dissent among patients, a lot of concern that their needs aren't being met as much, but it's kind of in a transition phase.
In Alaska?
In Alaska, it was one of the few states that had no dispensary system at all. So in that case, medical marijuana has been a big part of the debate during the implementation of adult use. Anytime the city was considering restricting edibles or anything, a lot of patients came and showed up and spoke about the issue from the perspective as patients. So the adult use stores will be the only regulated source for marijuana medical or not. Hopefully down the road there will be something added that's specifically for patients under 21, so they don't just have to have a caregiver that's over 21 or can go to them. But for the most part, all they can do is go to the adult use stores once they're operational. Of course, they're still grow your own, both for patients and also for all adult users. But it's really been a big part of the discussion. And one thing that when we talk about medical, the state that has the most medical marijuana patients per capita is Colorado, at 2% of the state's population of patients. But Pew did a study, and they asked, do you use marijuana? And if so, is it for medical or adult or for fun? And about half of them said it was for medical use. So in other words, there are a lot of people that are using marijuana medically, but are even not registered in some of these other states. And there was also a lot of overlap. So it's just something to keep in mind that there are a lot of people that use it both for fun and for medical. And that by having adult use, there's all these people that were being left behind from the programs because they didn't want to register for whatever reason.
Yeah, surprise, surprise, we're in a period of transition. 20 years of prohibition in Colorado, 2 years of taxing and regulating. But Sean, we've had about 15 years of medical marijuana infrastructure. Our medical marijuana first got started in 2000 or 2001. Right, and our dispensary system didn't really take off until 2009.
Well, 2009 it became what it is now, 2010.
So, kind of walk us through that more than decade-long period when it comes to caregivers not really being regulated, people coming from the illicit market, legitimizing themselves as caregivers. Then we start to regulate the market, and we end up basically over-regulating a lot of people out of the game. So walk us through that and tell us about that, maybe how things look now and where we need to go in the future.
Well, I think a really important frame for all this is something that Diego said at the beginning of his comments, which is that we should be thinking about how we do this better, right? So I'm going to tell the story, but I'm going to tell the story, not the official story. I'm going to tell you what actually happened. Because it's important that we change the frame on this discussion. So as you said, in the year 2000, Colorado voters approved Amendment 20. Amendment 20 did not have anything to speak of in terms of the commercial regulated infrastructure industry. So for the 9 years after that, that was the carrying card of every single legislator to not create a program to address it, because we don't know what the voters wanted. It wasn't in there. They said they wanted medical, and you can grow it at home, and that must have what they wanted. All those dispensaries everywhere, well, who cares about that? But you probably can't do that.
So people just started opening dispensaries.
So what happened there is that, you know, when and particularly in 2008, when the Obama administration issued their first Ogden memo, well, I guess that was the Ogden, there it was called. The industry started to just show up. People were getting tax licenses from their local government and setting up shop. And so what happened is in 2010, in response to this, the legislature passed a bill, which is, as what sort of remember, for HB 1284. And this was designed not to, hey, let's create a new medical marijuana industry, isn't this great? It was a cobbling together of a few people who absolutely hated all this, wanted to all this go away. Some people who were kind of like, in the middle. And the few members of the legislature who at the time were actually active medical marijuana supporters, they weren't there at all because they didn't want to pass this bill at all. And if you go back at look at the roll call, it's very interesting. People who voted no on, for example, our current House Speaker, Diego Holmhorst, Boulder Democrat, not exactly anti-cannabis, voted no. And the reason being because the rules were designed to be restrictive. It was designed to put people out of business. It was designed to get people out of the industry. And the Senate sponsor, Chris Romer, actually said, the plan is that we'll see a 40% attrition in the industry. Well, by 2011, when the licensing regime was fully implemented, they did that number precisely. So whether or not you agree with the outcome, you can certainly say the policy works. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It did the following ways, and mandated vertical integration, which meant that now you couldn't be just a cultivator or just a retailer. You had to now manage your entire supply chain. So it created all these forced marriages. That's one way to get rid of people. So you make the two businesses force them to become one. It also introduced, which I think was the biggest mistake, and why I really want to focus on to talk about how to make this better, is they introduced license suitability. And people have to be very careful with that, particularly in your states as you're moving forward, because if you want prohibitionists to get a stranglehold in the legislative process, license suitability is going to be the way to do it, because it sounds good. Oh, we don't want criminals. We don't, okay, that's great. But according to Colorado's law, you could technically have murdered someone 5 years ago. If you have completed your sentence, then you could go ahead and apply for a retail medical marijuana license and own one of the businesses. However, if your crime was you got busted selling pot, in the medical program, you weren't allowed to own a business at all, and you're still not. You will be able to 5 years from now. If 5 years from now, well, actually now we're kind of after 3. It's the same in the retail program. We actually had to amend the medical program to catch up to the retail programs, slightly less economically and social unjust policy. And so the way it works now is that in 2018, if your marijuana crime was discharged 10 years prior to that, or earlier, now you can have this great economic opportunity. Never mind the ship sailed 5 years ago. And the reason that's important is, particularly what Diego's talking about, what they're on the front end addressing these things, is there is, I'll put it this way, what would Portland or Denver or Salt Lake look like if we had actually done 5 acres in Mule? Right? Those would be radically different cities. And the reason is because wealth takes generations to acquire, right? And the same way for an individual and a family, same way for a business. Becoming a large, successful business will take time. Well, if the people who now you have an industry where because of this, there's a lot of over-regulation, disguised as concern for public safety. Starts out as a legitimate concern, but it goes too far because when you think, okay, well, first of all, you can't have had a drug felony of any kind. Well, that sounds good. It's ridiculous because the whole point of the justice system is that you paid your debt.
Yeah, and it's just not about the overregulation when it comes to, inclusion practices and hiring standards. I mean, we have overregulation in a lot of different areas.
Right.
We have to have child-proof packaging. You go buy a gram of marijuana, you get like 30 years worth of plastic.
All these things are, they end up becoming barriers to entry too. So let's say you are a person in Colorado who is a person of color or ready to blood, because there aren't many of us in Colorado. That's nobody's fault. It's just the way it is, right? And you're a person of color who somehow, some way managed to get through like that, having any bad student debt or ever having to run into the law. I mean, it's just statistically, this becomes a very, 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 very rare unicorn. So what we have is, on the good side, we have an industry that is led 36% by women. Of my client base, most of them are women. So that's one area where there is being some level of social justice. And I think the word was restitution, and I think that's an appropriate word because the way I view it now, having the experience of working for Mr. Poles, Jared Poles, in Congress, and working on this policy from a number of areas, I really do see most of the people that were incarcerated because of marijuana as victims of, of the drug war. And so I think that and what we've done in Colorado, I think is so tragic, is that we've taken the people who are the biggest victims of the war and prohibited them from profiting in peace.
Yep.
Amen.
Nothing is set in stone, though, correct? We can.
Well, we have this offer thing yeah, maybe we could, move that start date of 2018 to 2016 or 2017, and every single session, my clients, that's the number one thing on their agenda. But the reality is now everyone's like, well, but it's already going to go away by itself later, so we don't have to fix it because it misunderstands the underlying problem, which is that if the people who were the victims of the war on cannabis don't have the opportunity to participate meaningfully in the peace on the front end, that ship will sail, and they'll never have had that opportunity. So what I encourage in other states is that the first thing you do is don't make that mistake. It's not plutonium, it's cannabis.
So I mentioned something being set in stone as a segue to Ohio. Any thoughts on Ohio from any of you?
Well, I would like to say that, and I got in a debate with a gentleman in this room the other day, that I was actually happy that it didn't pass. I realized that patients are left in the lurch, but to create a monopoly, and that's what the Ohio issue would have done, was legalizing for 12 business or 12 entities were allowed to obtain their licenses, creating a monopoly, which then created another issue that voters voted on to prevent monopolies from happening. So while patients are still going to have to be in a high-risk environment and use cannabis and perhaps get in trouble for it, I think that if that law would have passed, it would have set a really bad precedent, especially because of what Sean just spoke about. It would just be shutting even more people out of this phenomenal opportunity.
Colorado wasn't perfect, but when you talk about those campaigns, the Minimum 64 campaign, I-502 campaign, Washington wasn't perfect either. I mean, what did the Colorado and Washington campaigns do that Ohio didn't seem to? give a damn about.
Well, outside of suitability issues, anybody can get into the market if you have enough money to get into it. Whereas in Ohio, it would have just shut people out. So for me, that's the largest issue. The free market, exactly. Never said that.
Let's put Karen on the hot seat.
I was just going to say really quickly that, you know, what we're seeing, I think, is as other states start looking at regulation and implementation, that we are seeing that not just Ohio, but even through regulation and legislation is, again, these high barriers to entry, you know, high requirements for, you know, you have to have a certain amount of cash on hand, and you have to have, you know, the license fees are so high, and et cetera. So I think Ohio is sort of an obvious example of that, but I think we're seeing this in laws, et cetera, around the country.
I can really quickly to that, Terry, because you're absolutely right about the barriers to entry, and it's not always, you know, the people that you would expect, law enforcement or whatever, trying to create. Sometimes it's the injury itself. So one thing that I would tell people to be careful of as they move to other states is beware of regulatory capture. We're in the industry, we do it too. And we can get the regulators on our side to do what we want so that it looks like it's better for everybody, but it really is only just good for us. Yeah, that's what lobbyists get paid to do. That's the entire job. That's my entire race. Let me just, right. So, I mean, and I don't mean to be flippant or sarcastic, but I do mean to make it clear to everyone that now there are two parts to this movement. There is still the social justice policy. There's definitely an overlap between the two, but there is definitely now an industry. And, you know, and they're definitely interested, I know because it's my job, and what's going to be good for our interests.
Okay, there's your real quick shot. All right.
So, of course, it was an off-year election in Ohio, so it was going to be more challenging to pass a measure no matter what because of that kind